Window seat surfing on the wing. As an adolescent, I dreamed of big things. Climb to the top of the mountain to see the scene. Petty wap don't want me to have anything. I'm the captain, no jet lag. Boeing jet swag. Floating to the sunset, keep the drinks coming back. She summoned me, gave me turbulence on the sink. Pretty flight attendant boarding pass, I'm a buddy. Stunting first class.
I lived in Saudi Arabia, and where I taught English for 2 years as a civilian military contractor. I left Saudi Arabia in 2018. I returned to the Middle East, the Middle Eastern region. Well, what do we call that? I returned to, that's still Asia, or it's part of Africa. I said Middle East, but the Middle East is a term I believe was popularized during the Gulf War era, 1990, the 1990s. Perhaps it was, that area was just called Arabia. I should do some research and figure out what that area was called. There are so many gaps in my knowledge. But hey, I lived there. So for, yes, there may be gaps in my knowledge of history, but what I'm sharing here are firsthand accounts of my experiences. Now I'm going to talk about Oman. As I mentioned, I moved back to that region, whatever it's called, in 2019. As I said, I left Saudi Arabia in 2018, and let's see, for context, it was November 2018 when I left, and then I returned to that region in February of 2019. And between that time, I visited my uncle in Washington, D.C. You see, when I worked in Saudi Arabia, I was teaching and training students about, American military. Again, I was a civilian military contractor. So our whole curriculum was military based. And we often talked about American sites, American locations from Washington, D.C., but Texas, and perhaps the Grand Canyon came up, perhaps New York City came up. And while I was teaching these lessons and talking about these American locales, in my heart and in my mind, I said, dang, I haven't even been to these locations. Or rather, I haven't spent considerable time there to learn or to really get a sense of the place. And so when I quit that job in Saudi Arabia and moved back to America, I said, doggone it, I have to see America for myself, because these foreigners are getting an education about America, one that, or they're learning things and they're seeing, of course, they're seeing America, on video and in pictures. But I need to have that sense, that real sense of America for myself. And plus, I had traveled to so many other countries and I hadn't traveled America, and I thought, well, I need to do this. So I made my trip to Washington, D.C. that year in November of 2018 after returning from Saudi Arabia. And I went to North Carolina where I visited my another uncle. And all of these experiences informed me about life in America and informed me about my family's history. I visited the cemetery where my great grandfather and great grandmother are buried, as well as my great great grandmother. So that was enriching. I also didn't spend a lot of time in America. I made that trip to DC and to North Carolina, and when I got back to Los Angeles, sure, I could have traveled elsewhere. I know I went to Las Vegas. Or Nevada, rather. I visited my grandfather and grandmother in Las Vegas. They reside there. So let's see, Nevada, DC, and North Carolina. That's where I went. And after a few weeks in America, I was very concerned about how much money I was spending, because now I wasn't working. And what I did is I made a plan to travel to Costa Rica because I found a work-life program. It was an opportunity to live rent-free on an eco farm in Costa Rica. And you would work for 4 hours a day. So there was a trade-off of your work for, living for free. And I thought that was pretty cool. So I did that for what I hoped to be a pretty long time. It ended up being a 3-week stay, which is a long time. I thought the minimum amount of time I would stay would be 1 month, but it just proved to be a very, difficult experience, because I was sleeping in a tent. We had mattresses that were laid. The mattress was laid on the floor, and then the tent went over on top, and we laid. It was pretty comfortable, but there were mosquitoes, ants, cockroaches, tarantulas, spiders, caterpillars. You see, Costa Rica is home to, they say, 5% of the world's biodiversity. And sleeping at night, you're sleeping among the insects and the animals. So it was very loud at night. So it was quite a difficult experience. It was certainly, we weren't staying at hotels with baths. We couldn't, lather up the soap and bathe ourselves. Well, we had to shower under basically a water hose. Yeah, that was pretty interesting, because there was a pipe, and one of the travelers with me took a plastic water bottle, and he punctured several holes at the bottom of it. And he took the bottle and he put the bottle around this pipe. And because there were several holes in the bottle, after the water accumulated at the bottom of this bottle, so the water would pass through the pipe, it would go into the bottle, and then it would collect there. And then because of the holes, then you had these pores through which the water would pour, or the water would flow. So now he created a makeshift shower head, which was ingenious. And so we actually had a shower, but that's all we had was a shower. And to secure the bottle, the plastic bottle around the pipe, he used some tape or something, and it worked. It worked for a very long time. And it's like, that was an education in and of itself. If you can learn to be resourceful, and if you're creative, then you can enjoy some of the same luxuries that you have at, 5-star hotels. I mean, it certainly wasn't a 5-star hotel experience, but you can try to come close to it. We stayed clean because we showered and washed and all of that. Now, what I'm explaining here is how difficult, it was. We were among all of the insects, and that was uncomfortable. There were flying cockroaches. So the whole, disgusting factor, like, ugh, yuck. If you're comfortable with your luxurious, your clean, your sanitized surroundings, and you can't fathom, putting yourself in nature, well, you're going to be at a disadvantage. I was willing to do it. I was willing to go through it, and I'm glad I had a 3-week experience in the jungle. But after that 3 weeks, I was ready to return home, or see something different. So I made it through 3 weeks in Costa Rica. Very minimal, life, camping as it were. Although we slept in tents, there was a platform. There was this there was a platform. There were no walls. There was this structure, and it had a floor and it had a roof. There were no walls, and on the floor, of course, it was elevated a few feet, and we had to climb up to get to the platform. But that's where we laid our mattresses and set up our tents. So we had protection from the rain, and it certainly rained. So there was a tin roof, a large tin roof, under which we set up our tents. So we were not directly affected by the rain. There were no holes, or no the water never dripped through. It was a sound roof, and so we were protected from the rain and from the elements. So that was Costa Rica for 3 weeks. And then, as I said, I went back to Arabia, that whole region, and I worked in Oman. And Oman was different from Saudi Arabia because Saudi Arabia was extremely conservative, extremely rigid. Women covered their heads, covered their hair, covered their faces, covered their bodies from head to toe. They wore the hijab, the niqab, the abaya. These are all names of the clothing that women wore. Oftentimes, you would only see a woman's eyes. The rest of her body was covered. Maybe her hands were visible, but her hair, her face, that was covered. There were some women who covered their bodies from head to toe. Even there was a veil over their faces, and so you couldn't see their face. You couldn't see their eyes. You couldn't see. It was like this ghostly, this all black ghost moving through shopping malls and stores all throughout society. And even some women covered their hands. They had gloves on, black gloves, and those gloves were probably elbow length. So everything, every inch, every centimeter of the woman's body was covered, and that was wild. So that's the reality. So that was Saudi Arabia. And the rule is a man should never speak to a woman in Saudi Arabia. And that was the rule, and I followed that rule. I'm not a Muslim, and I don't speak Arabic. So that complicated things for me, because for the most part, there was no communication with a woman in Saudi Arabia for me. But I remember I had an Egyptian colleague, and he felt at liberty to break the rules because he thought this is ridiculous. Because in Egypt, men and women can converse and have no problem. So when we were shopping together, he would tell the women who were the clerks, the cashiers. He would tell them, "Oh, your eyes are beautiful." He was flirting with these women. Nothing ever happened to him, but he certainly felt at liberty to do that, whereas I felt like, don't you do anything. You can't you can't do any of that. So I didn't. When I lived in Oman, then Oman is a very different Muslim country. They practice a different Islam. They practice a different style. So in Saudi Arabia, the predominant Muslim sect is Sunni, and in other parts of in other Middle Eastern, in other Muslim countries, you have different majorities. Okay, to compare, in Iran is mostly Shia. All right. Same thing with I believe in Iraq. It's mostly Shia Muslims. Saudi Arabia, Sunni. In Oman, you have a sect of Muslims, or a type of Islam called Ibadi, and it's a more peaceful, more relaxed style. I found that the restrictions that were placed on women in Oman, they were reduced, lessened. For instance, I had American colleagues in Oman, or non-Muslim colleagues, females, I'm talking about the women, in Oman, and they did not cover their hair. This, would certainly not be allowed for women in other countries, especially, I imagine, Iran, because I've never been to Iran, but in Saudi Arabia, absolutely. If you're a foreigner in Saudi Arabia, you have to cover, if you're a woman, you have to cover your hair. And so Oman was more relaxed. And I remember one of my initial trips to Oman from Saudi Arabia before working in Oman. So I took a trip from Saudi Arabia to Oman in 2017, and I was shocked by the contrast, because in Oman, women would talk to me, especially I recall one cashier. I stayed at the hotel. I was going for breakfast at the hotel, and the cashier spoke to me, and she told me that she thought that I was Muslim. And I said no, but I was shocked that a woman spoke to me and engaged me in a conversation. And so she asked me where I was from and what have you. And I just thought, wow, I'm talking to a woman in a Muslim country. So that really informed me about the differences between Saudi Arabia and Oman. Well, that sort of that interaction, made me feel comfortable with just interacting with women in Muslim countries, and it kind of carried over. When I went back to Saudi Arabia, it was during the prayer time. You see, in Saudi Arabia, they pray 5 times a day, or in Muslim countries, there are prayers 5 times a day. If you observe those prayers five times a day, then then you observe it. But in Saudi Arabia, they close their shops, they close their businesses to observe the prayer for 30 minutes or so, for their prayer. So it was at prayer time when I was walking into a store, and unbeknownst to me, I didn't know the store's policy. You see, in Saudi Arabia, the stores Sometimes the doors will remain open, especially if it's a supermarket. The doors will remain open during the prayer, but the cashiers will all leave their stations and go and pray. So as a customer, you can still enter the store, but you can't check out. You can do your shopping, gather your goods, but you'll be waiting in line until the cashiers return. All right. So I did not know if I should enter the supermarket while I was, on my way in there. And I had forgotten the prayer times. I was just in a rush. Like, let me just get in here and get a few things. Well, there was a woman, a Muslim woman, a Saudi, sitting outside, covered in, the abaya and the hijab and what have you. And I had returned from Oman, where I had spoken to a woman and had no problems. And I guess I forgot where I was because I approached the supermarket, and this woman, she was an older woman, was sitting outside with her bags. She had already finished shopping, and I guess she was waiting for her driver to pick her up. And I just thought it was an innocent question, but I wanted to know if it was safe for me to enter the supermarket. So as I approached the entrance of the supermarket, I turned to the woman and I spoke to her and I said, "Is it okay if I enter now? Is the supermarket open?" Or I asked her whatever I was asking her to clarify, "Can I go in here? Is it okay?" And that woman flipped. She said, "What?" And she didn't just say, "What?" She said, "What?" She was like, I don't know, just, oh, I remember. She said, "Too close." Because when I approached her, this was completely off limits in Saudi Arabia. A man approaches a woman and speaks to a woman. She said, "What? Too close." And she yelled it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm in Saudi Arabia. I'm not in Oman. And the tone, the volume, and the power with which she said this, shocked me. And at once, although I was looking at her, as soon as she spoke up, I looked away. I looked on the ground. I was like, whoops. And I made a 180. I turned, I pivoted, and dropped my gaze. And I was like, ooh, shoot. And I walked into the supermarket. So it didn't matter if it was just a casual or a nice whatever, or what I thought was innocent. No, speaking to a woman in Saudi Arabia, don't even try it. Don't attempt it. So I imagine this woman was an older Saudi woman who didn't play, and she was like, follow our rules. And the force with which she said, "What?" And she said, "Too close." She was like, it was like, I don't know. It was like, how dare you? Don't you even think of it? And I was like, whoa, excuse me. So that was my story about Saudi Arabia. After having traveled to Oman, my guards were down. I felt relaxed. This was about probably a year into my stay in Saudi Arabia. So, my fear of bad things happening, was diminished. No. Excuse me. It wasn't a year into my stay. It was several months into my stay. Right. It wasn't a year. This was 3 or 4 months, at most 6 months, into my stay. I guess it's about 6 to 8 months. So I was slowly getting, acclimated to my surroundings. But, an incident like that surely informed me of, or reinforced those rules. Don't get comfortable in Saudi Arabia at all. So I guess I'm proud to say, I never spoke to I never spoke to another Saudi woman in Saudi Arabia. Now, I can't say that I never spoke to any women in Saudi Arabia because that's not true. There were a number of Ethiopians who lived in Saudi Arabia, and they were maids, nannies, servants. They also, they did not live within our compound, but we were, I guess I had friends of friends. Yes, we had friends of friends, and so through mutual friends, then we became acquainted, and I offered I offered to have them work for me. So I needed help managing my apartment, keeping it clean and whatnot. So I would hire my Ethiopian friends to come over, and of course I paid them handsomely because I'm like, yo, by that time in 2017 I had traveled to Ethiopia. So I was like, I need to take care of my Ethiopian, sisters. So come help me out, help clean up my apartment. I'll pay you handsomely. I'll take good care of you. Because, the Saudis, the Saudis in some cases, in some instances, they were taking advantage of the Ethiopians because they were migrant workers. Sometimes they would not pay them and they were treated poorly. So, but in my case, I was proud to support my Ethiopian brothers or sisters, but because I had an appreciation for my Ethiopian brothers and sisters, a newfound appreciation from my travels to Ethiopia and what I learned, about Ethiopian culture that I didn't learn in America, Yeah, so I had to be very careful about talking to women, but it was only the Ethiopian women I met in Saudi Arabia did I interact with. That's it. Outside of that, there was an Egyptian doctor, a woman, female doctor at the hospital. I talked with her, and surprisingly, a woman, a female doctor was there to serve. That was sort of progressive for Saudi Arabia. But for the most part, I did not talk to women in Saudi Arabia at all. And Oman, however, when I moved to Oman in 2019, my colleagues were women. Talking to a woman in public was, fine. It was accepted. However, Omani women, especially the more traditional Omani women who lived away from the capital, the same rules pretty much applied. No. Correction. You could talk to an Omani woman. I remember going to the fair, to the festival, and the women were serving food, and I could talk to them and ask a question or place my order with them. That was no problem. But the Omani, my students, male students, told me, do not take pictures of Omani women. I was at the fair. I did get a photo, and I posted it to my website, and I was talking about my experience in Oman and sharing that experience with my students. That's when they saw the photo and they said, no. You don't take pictures of Omani women, and you do not post those pictures to your website. They said, teacher, take those pictures down. So I was receptive to what they said. I thought, wow, okay, I've learned a lesson there. I think the photo is still up on my website, though. I'm not in Oman anymore, but it is what it is. So those are some of the experiences I had in that region of the world between Oman, Saudi Arabia, and And then between my trips, or between my stays in Saudi Arabia and Oman, Costa Rica, I spent some time there in Costa Rica. Yeah, those are some stories for you.
Window seat surfing on the wing. As an adolescent, I dreamed of big things. Climb to the top of the mountain to see the scene. Petty wap don't want me to have anything. I'm the captain, no jet lag. Boeing jet swag. Floating to the sunset, keep the drinks coming back. She summoned me, gave me turbulence on the sink. Pretty flight attendant boarding pass, I'm a buddy. Stunting first class.